the goal of this the roundtable is to discuss the notion of historical time, to Berber Bevernage, the notion of historical time, as said by historians, has more to do with the perspective of perpetrators than their victims. So the goal of this debate is to enlarge different perspective of ancestral time, political time, quotidian time, historical time. So that said, we invite the participants to compose our table now. Professor Marcello Felisberto, Morais de Assunção, Professor Hippolyte, Brice, Sogbossi, Professor Héctor Moreno, Aline, Rochedo, Pachamama, historian, editor, mediated by our dear Professor Fernanda Oliveira, at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. We thank you the presence of you all, Baba Luciano, also to discuss. And we also had Edson Capo, but he had a change in his flight, so he was rescheduled. He'll be in a meeting tomorrow. He'll be in activity tomorrow. It is updated in our website. Okay, have a nice meeting. Fernanda, that's with you now. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fernanda Oliveira. So I'll do my self-description quickly. I'm a Black woman. I have curly hair, shoulder length. I'm wearing glasses. I'm wearing a blue skirt, a white blazer. I'm a tall woman. I greet you all. Thank you for your presence, especially in the morning of Saturday morning in such a beautiful city as Florianopolis. It's so good to have you here. And I hope we can follow up with these discussions that are crucial, not only for academic matters, but also for our existence in the world, activity, social movements, and the presence and collectivity, which is what moves us. So that said, I greet my companions, my table companions, very quickly. So I'll explain to you the dynamics of a roundtable, this talk. We will have between 10 and 15 minutes to the initial points, and then we will dialogue with the participation of the audience. So in this first moment, I will invite Aline Pachamama for her first considerations. And so I will put an initial question for us to reflect upon. So this question is about thinking about historical time. Since you've been interpreting this time in your work, social movements, academic activity, the production of sense of what moves us and brings us here, how does this historical time has been put in its different connections and possibilities? From what Professor Claudia in her opening has brought us ancestral time, circulating time, time that is extended, expanded, these kinds of reconfigurations that time has had brought us and purpassed us. I'd like to hear in this first moment your considerations, so please feel comfortable, and I would like to, so we'll follow up in our dialogue. Please, Aline. Oh, greetings, Abejala Tsate. Abejala is the name of our continent, of the original people, the vibrating, pulsing, flowering, bleeding land. I'm Aline Rochedo Pachamama. I'd like to greet my relative here, Val, the ancestors, our ancestors who have fought with the original people, the Atlantic people, Black people. I'm an indigenous woman. I dream that people get to know me for my vibrations, not my physical shape, the energy that emanates from my person, the seeds. This instrument is maracá. It brings the forest wherever we are. I bring the forest in this moment here in my important speech. I have my feet on the earth so that I don't forget where I come from. And even if I'm in the academia, that really values degrees, I know the importance they have to my people. There are degrees that give a space that our history is inside the official history. But I don't want to have the academic ego. I don't want to have the academic hierarchy. I want to reap. There's a forest in me, research, sound of chants, small animals, several colors. There's a fire, ancestrality, the memories of my ancestors. There's fury as well, because they keep invading us, because they keep entering our territories, body, soul, spirit, because ancestor history is history as science, because our chant is the chant of Brazilian music, because our medicine has a capital M, because our architecture is also technology. Why does everyone insist and put us in a place that is not our place? Our knowledge does not rely on these degrees that are so admired. It relies on the strong relationships with the roots that are under this concrete floor, the roots that are bold, that break the floors, the sidewalks, the trees that are prevented from getting born. Why in schools they put as Indians? Why in schools in the regions in which there are originary people, no one knows anything about these people? Great light to you. Infinite gratefulness to learning how to listen. We need to learn to listen. Our learning of every day, not just to listen those who are keen to us, but we understand that in this earth, in this plane, that is also history, and history is in the earth. This is the title of a book that I have reaped words. The history is in the land. The history of the forest is related to the story of the originary people, the medicine of the forest related to our medicine. And when the colonization got here, we have received them. They got sick, poor, with oppressive beliefs that made them they dumped the bodies of the sick crew. When our Black brothers got here, we welcomed them and we fought together. We cannot forget that the Quilombo is a big revolution in this country. Forget French Revolution, leave them for the Frenchmen. Let's teach about the Quilombos to the kids. Let's teach the kids that our month is the month of August, the day of the originary people in Brazil. And these originary people need historical atonement. So when I write about history, I write about life. It's not history in which we sit in an office. It's history that pulsates inside us. It wants to leave. Just like seeds there on the floor. And the rays say, wake up. That's like word. That's what word is for us. It goes from necessity, so that understanding about ourselves as citizens of this country, active participants, is honored, so that our history is in schools and not just Iracema. We had this, enough of this. So it's our histories. And don't tell me about tales. The tales, it's just our experiences. Ancestral stories of our time. And I don't know about Crossroads because I see the spiraling roads because everything is circulating in life. So this meeting is a movement that we throw a rock in a lake at Mantiqueira, and there's that beautiful reverberation of energy, so that we can be here, but take what has been reaped here to our life, so that there are more spaces to the originary people in universities to honor their knowledge, so that if we have to talk about school, to originary cultures in schools, our 275 languages, all our people, that has to be us there and not outsourced. So if while our country does not honor the originary peoples, we cannot talk about democracy. While we use gold, while Yanomamis are still suffering with mining, we cannot talk about democracy. While we try to use public notice by Vale, while Vale is destroying our rivers, we cannot talk about democracy. While Coca-Cola is still inside your food script, we cannot talk about democracy because our languages are being stopped but English is empowering. I have to know English. Who knows the word of my people? So I'd like to thank by the learning to listen, and I'd like to dialogue with you. I hope to dialogue with you a little more. Thank you very much, Aline. I'm going to seize the floor to Héctor.
No se logra ver bien. Bueno.
Well,
Buenos días.
good morning. My name is Héctor Nahuelpan. I am Mapuche. I'd like to thank for the invitation. I don't speak Portuguese, so I will speak Spanish. I'll try to speak slowly so that you can understand me. Can you understand me? Wonderful. This is an important thing. Well, I was told that I have 10 to 15 minutes, so I will try to respect the time. When I was called, they asked me if it was possible to expand the understanding of historical time. This is a very broad question, very abstract. And I try to think of it as an interpretative answer based on the work that we've been doing in history, in the Mapuche history, but in particular in indigenous history. And in particular, in the field of the relationship between the indigenous peoples and the colonization process. So that's my focus. My interest, at least for the 20 years in which I've been working with this, it's been not to reclaim certain particularities, but in being able to understand the domination histories, the domination relations, oppression and resistance of which we've been exposed and connected historically, thinking that it's necessary to know these relationships in order to be able to develop our liberation processes and decolonization processes. And thinking about those things, if we had to reflect or think, well, I mean, beyond this linear conception of historical time, when I come close to understanding historical time having to do with colonization and the indigenous peoples, it is along the lines of analyzing how the main antagonisms, the main conflicts, the main challenges that we face, we native indigenous peoples currently, but not only indigenous people, but they're connected to the coexistence, to the contradiction of a series of different horizons in time and history or cycles of colonization. And the interrelation, the antagonism, or the friction that they produce, you know, these historical cycles, that's what I try to expose. And they come, from my point of view, they come to shed light or give us clues about the tensions that we face, the challenges that we face. And those make us understand historical time, but not only history, but also space and territorialities beyond a lineal construction or beyond a Euclidean understanding or Cartesian understanding of time and space that we have naturalized. And from this point of view, this is the first explanation. The second thing would be that when we think of colonization,
lamentablemente,
unfortunately,
la propia colonización
the colonization itself
del debate.
establishes the terms of the debate.
Los hermanos, hermanas,
Brothers and sisters, indigenous and non-indigenous brothers and sisters who were colonized by the British, they establish their terms of the debate under the colonization in relation to the dominating language.
tienen una
United States and Canada, they have their own debate about colonization.
territorios que fueron
In the case of the territories that have been colonized,
sometidos por
submitted
también
by the Spanish people, they also have their own discussions about colonization. And here in Brazil, from the peoples who have been colonized by Portugal, they establish their own terms for the colonization debate. So in my view, it's necessary to not only overcome the debate according to each people or according to the borders of the national states, but also the reductions and discussions that were put forward by them.
vinculado a
So should
Iceland, ¿no?
we think about the debate according to what they say? The United States, Canada, Latin America, or these territories that now are known as Brazil. And under these terms,
Con limitaciones, pienso
with my own limitations and restrictions, I think it's possible to identify at least 4 historical cycles that are related
distintos niveles de tempo.
to different levels of time that coexist in our present time.
No es un proceso lineal, sino que tiene
It's not a linear process. It has to do with cycles that inhabit the other, and each cycle sees the other cycle, and it comes to the other cycle. And in a succession, this generates an accumulation of experiences, historical times, to condensate into a series of conflicts and antagonists that we are going through, us indigenous peoples, but not only us as indigenous peoples, but from my point of view of the humanity in general.
Y a mí me parece que
And to me, it seems that, well, the first cycle, in terms of time, I'm not going to be able to develop it much, but the first cycle has to do with
inicia con el mundo de la
the start of the conquest and the colonization process of the
fundamentalmente,
area in the end of the 15th and the 16th centuries. The cataclysmic effect that it produces, this conquest in the society, in the pre-existing societies, because we need to acknowledge that the societies, the nations that were there before,
tenían
and of which we come, they had very old, ancient roots, and we don't think about that as much. We're talking about thousands of years.
estamos hablando de una
We're talking about a diversity
nación
of people, nations, ways in which they lived and understand things, and of relating to the humanity. And we're talking about many ways, different ways of social and political organization, of relationship with the territory, of ways of production that are age-old, of an ecological diversity, linguistic diversity, multi-linguistic, because the difference of the 3 and 4 official languages that we have, different from that, at that moment, there were a diversity, a huge diversity of languages, of systems of knowledge.
es necesario dimensionar. Yo siempre
It's necessary to think, because I always tell my students that we have to imagine this world historically, this world that ended up being reduced. Initially, you had the ontological production of it was reduced to this category of Indians. So the first cycle is marked by this ontological production of this notion of Indians, and that's going to follow us until our time, our current present time. Yeah, the notion of Indians, not only like a category of the colonial situation, as said by an anthropologist and historian, Mexican Guillermo von Fipataye, but also an ontological production, like a being that is not only in servitude that must serve, but also as a being that must be eliminated. It must be dispossessed, this being, a being whose existence is only going to acquire sense as it provides life to another person. And under its foundation, the ontological production of the Indian or the indigenous peoples is going to be with us until today. And that's going to be the base and the foundation in which capitalism works, as Marx used to say, based on compulsive work in forms of slavery and indigenous peoples and many other peoples. And there's also a systematic aggression under about the territory itself. The base of extractivism that we know or that we conceptualize currently with our notion of that. It's the base of accumulation of capital and wealth, and that also has led to a precipice of death and has caused the crisis that we have, the ecological crisis and climate crisis that we have. So this is the first historical cycle that is marked by that, and also by what was called this just war, the fair war, the so-called, and the colonization of water, the more explicit violence and the more symbolical violence, or so quote unquote veiled, although they were personified in the person of the priest and the cross. There are mechanisms of logic of control and subversion that until today we have with us. This is the first cycle. In my point of view, it would be in temporal and time Cartesian or Gregorian, sorry, marks until the end of the 18th century until the start of the 19th century. A second cycle begins in the 19th century. And in my view, it would be until approximately 1930, 1940, and is marked by the processes of the impact that the Constitution of the Republic marks, and also on the indigenous population. Initially, by means of this patrimonialization of indigenous people and the so-called independence processes, afterwards, within the scope of the consolidation of the states and the nations, and in this process of expansion lived by capitalism on an international level in the world stage, with a few people who come from the history area following Eric Hobsbawm, they can identify as the era of the empires. The indigenous people, they end up going through a process of aggression that is going to have a size that's very similar to the previous cycle. And it has to do fundamentally with a series of dynamics of conquests and colonization that they start to go through in this process of constitution of the states. United States, Canada, Mexico, all of this geopolitical setup that we know is built based on this conquest and forced incorporation of the indigenous peoples. Brazil also, you know. And this, in many cases, originates what, in my point of view, we have in common with what is mentioned as colonialism. I think the colonial issue more theoretical, related in the indigenous sense to this perspective that the post-colonial theory or decolonial ways of thinking, at least in the case of the indigenous people, and in dialogue with certain connections based on interpretations and strict interpretation of the ways of accumulation. So the indigenous people are going to live through this cataclysmic moment, traumatic moment. They're going to go through that again. And this has to do with construction of these types of societies in dynamics of whitening. And Brazil was one of the laboratories of this dynamic. When we think about the immigration, European immigration that they had at the start of the 19th century and until parts of the 20th century. Afterwards, we can find a third cycle. On my point of view, that corresponds to the 20th century, and it is marked by dynamics of citizenship that has to do with the effect of the impact on the indigenous population. This political, ideological thread wanted indigenous people to become modernized, to become quote unquote cultured, and incorporated it into the national life, not by means of genocide policies anymore that were implemented in the 19th century or during the first cycle, but by means of education, schooling, jobs, servitude. And during this time is when it also produced what in other contexts, for example, in the Australian context or in New Zealand, it's what we called the robbed generations. This is a discussion that we need to have, and we have not had that. Probably, if there's an indigenous brother or sister who's present here with more than, they must have more than one experiences if they start to think about their families in terms of the sequestration, in terms of child labor of a few members of their families, with missions. We need to also talk about the ecclesiastical power here and in different religious orders with which the states established acts and agreements. There are actors that are not mentioned, and they're getting away with it, like the church. Sometimes the church is protected, but it is part of this history of colonization and also of a history of genocide, because a genocide not only has to do with the physical death, it also has to do with disarticulation processes, systematic violence, with the loss of the sense of totality of the people. It has to do with killing everyone, but not only that. It has to do with the lack of existence more than the limits in terms of social and political terms established by the state towards a capital. We cannot analyze the different times in relations of power and domination and oppression, or think about the liberation processes if we don't think about the capitalism. Capitalism is the twin brother of colonialism. It's necessary to think about this under these terms. And lastly, from my view, there's a fourth cycle in which we are now. And in my view, it would begin in the 1980s, depending on the geography, 1990s, and it happens until now. And it is essentially marked by resurgence processes lived by the indigenous people globally, because this resurgence process for the indigenous people is not circumscribed to certain areas or certain places like Chile, Brazil. No, it's a global dynamic. And it's a paradox because you have this resurgence process as you have a crisis of the reports that we had that was in the predominance of these discussions with respect to historical time and the possibilities of transformation, social transformation of the reality. And in the case of Latin America, it's going to have its expression in which, as the indigenous peoples resurface, because we're always doing that actually, but recently we're doing that, we start to stop having revolutionary armed movements. But this resurgence coincides with certain changes that the economic system is going to have fundamentally in implementation of neoliberalism and the oppression that starts to have the territories, fundamentally indigenous territories, right? And this fourth cycle is marked by demands like autonomy, self-determination, but not only that, but also construction processes of autonomic demands and self-determination. And the example that we have that's more important, I think, is the experience of Zapatista, our brothers and sisters in the southeast of what we know now as Mexico, in Chiapas, and the autonomic demand and territorial demands that have to do with the autonomy in a transversal process and all of that. And also that has to do with certain dynamics, like, for example, militarization or paramilitarization. I imagine that, well, here, Brazil is one of the examples, right? Chile, if we think about it, the entire continent is marked by that, because currently you have this context of a transition, economic transition process, and you have China, Russia, and the Ukraine war, but there's an entire setup of militarization, and at the same time, that in the level of different political areas, as in the case that you have in Latin America, in each of the processes, we could also see the reconfiguration of militarization. But we have that now, and we can see that, and that's what it is, unfortunately, when we're not only looking at certain debates that are more private or more socialist, or, we're not aware of this dynamic that are essential to be able to understand and to analyze the world in which we're living, because we're seeing that. So we want to provide a debate that's serious about that, not only for indigenous populations, but we need to discuss this type of process, because essentially the dynamics that we have, like militarization, they're based on patterns of accumulation of capital in view of this global economic crisis. It's about all of that. And it's necessary to use and to know what it is, so that we can generate social control mechanisms or new territories, new terrains for the effect of being able to solve this crisis. So one important element in this cycle is militarization. and also the political configurations, things that also don't solve the problem of colonialism and capitalism, national states, the policies that we have, affirmative action policies. Those are ways of minimizing these great contradictions. But if we think seriously about projections for indigenous people, but also in the humanity, those are ways of softening and minimizing these conditions, as I said before. Well, several other things, but I'm not going to extend myself. But today, in my view, it is possible to think about quote-unquote alternative ways, because I think these ways of interpreting historical time, more than alternatives, they could guide us toward having a much more acute understanding of the challenges that we face now, not only for the indigenous people, but also for the society in general terms. And all of these ways are also marked by elements of change and continuity that can be produced. In the case of indigenous people, for example, they have to do, because there are many, right? Indigenous people, we're not, it's essence. We are so, we have a diversity of expressions, but also actions and possibility of having historical agency that has to do with alliance and collaboration and adoption and adaptation, pact, negotiation, day-to-day resistance and the scale of social racial hierarchies and class and the petition and the demand and collective action, until ways that lead to rebellion and insurgents. It's possible to track these historical agency actions in these different cycles, and also the accumulation of knowledge and experience on the foundation of these different historical agencies. But it is also possible to track or see common elements that remain or provide a form, but are present in different historical cycles, and they're constant, and they're also connected to colonialism and its twin brother capitalism. And they have to do with dispossession, they have to do with genocide, they have to do with violence, and they have to do with possession and control. So it's a way of coming closer to thinking about possibilities of expanding our understanding of historical time beyond a lineal vision. That's what I had to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to continue here. I'm going to pass the floor to Hippolyte. Is it correct, my pronunciation? All right. Okay, so I'll pass the floor to him, and thank you. Dr. Hippolyte. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of being here to share with you knowledge. My name is Hippolyte Brice Sogbossi. I was born in Benin, and I studied in Cuba and here in Brazil. Currently, I'm a professor at the Federal University of Sergipe. I am diving on this theme. I've been working on this for 30 years, since 1991. Yes, 31 years of work. This theme of the dialogue between Africa and the Americas. Within the scope of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to try to ponder a few aspects of this experience. Not only the dialogue is established from Africa to the Americas, but also from the Americas to Africa. So if we have forced immigration to the Americas, after a few centuries, we also had the return to the so-called roots. So I'd like to provide a picture here, because I know that my presentation cannot be made in more than 10-15 minutes. So I'm going to summarize, because since we are talking about a historical time, I'd like to use a few categories of dialectology and linguistics, which is the concept of diachrony and synchronicity. And since we're talking about time, and I am going along the same lines as the ones who spoke before me, because they talked about a few aspects that had to do with linguistics. So in terms of diachrony and synchronicity, it is pertinent to report this experience that I've acquired along these years. First of all, I'd like to reinforce that we're talking about crossroads, and these crossroads, they are expressed by means of a divinity, African god called Eshu. I am Fom, Elegba. This divinity many times is seen as equivalent to devil, considering other religions, the hegemonical religious traditions. But we need to, be more humble and know that we are looking at a nation world, which is Africa. And if my predecessors, they talked about the multiplicity of languages and of people, and in Africa, it's no different. We have more than 5,000 languages, more than 5,000 people. And you see this forced migration to the Americas with all of this treasury. And you can see the size that these human types, accompanied by their cultures, how much they could give to these new lands. And so I'd like to take the opportunity to very briefly show the greeting done by this Legba divinity before, this ceremony, greeting. And I would also like to say that in our grounds and our homes that have African presence, we hear about this divinity, that opens and closes the paths. It's communication, and it has to do with joy and wisdom, because it speaks the language of the other orishas, of the other divinities and gods. So I like Professor Fabio, I don't know if it's a technician, to put these two images very briefly, the image of Yegba, before we continue. There's no voice. So it is a divinity, as we can see. There's a phallic symbol on the head, because it is a divinity that precedes the sexual act, and it also has to do with fertility and wisdom. It is blessing the Benin people, and it is transvested, because one of the roles and one of the presentations of this divinity has to do with ambiguity. The divinity can be, let's say, one person can be possessed as a woman or a man, and the acts, they're all ambiguous. There are gestures. Here it's in the person of a man that's blessing the people from Benin and wishing a happy new year. It's a divinity that's also concerned with fertility, so the crops and all of that, so prosperity. So it's wishing all good things to the people of Benin. And in the second image, it's not there, but you can see a lot of people
Pois é, está dizendo
So that's it. They're saying that we have to concern what's ours, not say bad things about other people, because that's bad.
no meio de toda essa alegria,
So, and among the joy,
diverte bastante com.
we have a lot of fun.
Então, quando nós entramos
And when we get inside the religious houses of Candomblé and we listen to this famous chant, we also listen to it in Cuba, in Brazil, in Africa, in Nigeria, and Benin. So this crossroads is manifested immediately. So when at the time of appreciating the content of this chant in Barabô, we don't need to know exactly what is the literal translation of this chant. The most important is its function, that is to initiate the ritual, to greet the voodoos, the orishas, etc. So I'll also detail other aspects that are about our own informal language, Portuguese, Spanish, and IT Creole, to talk about this weight that Africa has in our spoken language.
é comum ouvir aqui
And it's very common to hear this phrasal structure. I'm going to say to someone, I'm going to tell someone that you, whatever. I'm going to say someone to someone. This phrase structure is the same that happened in Western Africa, notably Fon and Yoruba. And the Portuguese wouldn't say exactly the same. Portuguese maybe say
essa parte
with a different pronoun. This particularity from Brazil is very characteristic of the Creole languages that were recomposed, re-elaborated in the American soil. It is the very same case of the Creole, Haitian Creole.
quer dizer legba,
They will say,
agô. Então, essa mesma estrutura
so this same structure is found in the Haitian Creole.
para mim.
Please open the door. Legba, open the door for me. So
É a mesma
the structure is always the same. It's the same found at the Creole at Martinica, that orchestra. It's called it's
Caçave, que é uma orquestra.
it's Cassav. It's an orchestra from Martinica. Has the same shape, the same way of using the words,
A mesma hora,
the Creole words, same order of the words. And when we go to Cuba, same situation applies. When they say that the bull that has no tail, the ox that has no tail, it's God that puts the flies away, which is a popular saying that it makes a reference to poor people. Poor people always have a God that will help them. So in the Fon cosmology, there is this thought, this philosophy that poor people always have someone that will help them. And in Haiti, this is even more clear.
quer dizer, ao
That means
não tem cauda,
the ox that has no tails, the good God always puts the flies away.
Então, essas semelhanças
So these similarities
frase de palavras,
in sentences and words are similarities that
a gente assiste
help us
essa experiência
to
de diálogo entre
mirror this dialogues between Africa and Americas. And in the opposite sense, as I was saying, in the other direction, actually, the reflux, according to Pierre Berger, they're descendants of Brazilians that went back to Africa, and they came back with several skills
arquitetura,
in architecture, parties they organize,
em geral.
basically general
Os agudais,
culture in general. So, for example,
Maria
Agudá will sing,
vem lá, Maria Joana, vem lá, Maria Joana, vem lá, Maria Joana. E não sabem o conteúdo.
and they don't even know the content of what they're saying. Formulated very well, the sentences very well, the poems
Canção, mas não sabem exatamente.
and the songs, but they don't know exactly what it means. But what matters here is the context in which they're singing,
Mãe d'água,
because there is the mother of the waters with the serpent and it dances. It's like Iemanjá dancing. It's what the African people learn in this side of the Atlantic. They have reformulated it in their culture and they conveyed it in an African context, and it was very well accepted in a way that we see the following fact: both in the flux and in the reflux, we have the knowledges that show that not always we have to attain to the literal meaning of words,
em que
but rather the context in which these words and sentences and the knowledge, the proverbs, were formulated.
nós aprendemos,
This is the most important.
mas também
We learned,
os
but also
os haitianos,
Brazilians, Cubans, Haitians, etc., Colombians, Venezuelans
da gente.
also learned from us. Thank you very much.
Bom, agradeço imensamente.
Okay, thank you very much. This is an incredible morning. We already hoped it would be. Now I'm going to yield the floor immediately to Marcello for your considerations, and I thank you already. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to share this table to these amazing people who are here.
Sou professor
I am a professor at the UFRGS, Education in Ethical Racial Relations. I thought that I would like to talk about something that bothers me for a long time in studying post-colonial and decolonial studies, especially from the history and historical theory perspective. It's a certain absence of a debate about whiteness, that is, the affirmation of a white identity.
Para mim, a teoria
That is, for me, the decolonial theory, when it has it's the core, like the race as a primary category of modernity, the whole legacy of the African diasporical thinking,
esse debate
when this debate is centered inside the racialization and race category, but with a small discussion about white identity and how white identity produces also policies in time. So I'd like to instigate you to think how this time policy whiteness has produced and still produces.
gostaria de começar com uma citação
So I would like to start by quoting and also to instigate you to think this policy of time whiteness.
e o Glissant
Edouard Glissant, he says,
está ainda em espanhol, não tem tradução, mas
also it's Spanish, I have my own translation here.
ele diz: a
He
história
says, the history with a capital H finishes where emerges the history of people once reputed as historyless. History with a capital H, the science history, is a fantasy, highly functional fantasy in the West, originating when the West itself has written the history of the world. If Hegel has relegated the African people to a historical perspective, the Amerindian people and the prehistory, reserving history only to European people. These Amerindian people got in history in a conception that their history is no longer relevant to us. This hierarchical process is denied to them in history in its form of rupture, resistance, and exploitation. So I'd like to think as this time policies of whiteness that produced the others in racism, colonialism, the categories of Blacks and the categories of whites as the denied categories, like the racism by denial. It hides what we have to affirm in a very categorical way, which is white supremacism. And it's impossible to think in the production of knowledge, thinking on the perspective of a historian, the production of subjects without thinking the role of whiteness and the systematic erasing of racialized subjects in which we think of as canon, the companion of text tradition. Walter Benjamin called the tradition of the oppressed, how this tradition of the oppressed is denied by the systemic racism, the white supremacism in the realm of the construction of the disciplinary knowledge. In history, in a certain way, is the lead actor in the construction of time, historicism in particular. We could mention Glissant, but many others have reflected upon that. And the post-colonial and decolonial thinking in a certain way, despite this difference, is a reflection upon this position of time and whiteness affirming in construction from mirrors, these others of colonialism and racism. And when we look at the disciplinary memories, when we think of history, we're thinking story of historiography, theory of history, and the fields who have reflected upon this doing, the historiographical doing, sociology of knowledge, the meta-theoretical fields who have discussed about this disciplinary. And there is an absence in the discussion field of the role of the whiteness in the construction of these fields. And even when we think, as I said in the beginning, in the post-colonial and decolonial theory, it's very few intersection. It's very sad. We can discuss it, at least where I know. This discussion of whiteness and the decolonial and post-colonial discussion. And my hypothesis regarding that has to do with the fact that the colonial and post-colonial theories, Professor, she has a great article, the owning in the academic about these experiences and the experience of the racialized subject. My thesis, my hypothesis, and I'm not alone here, there is a systematic appropriation of these knowledges and this experience of this indigenous, this Black population that had positions about time much richer than the time policy of history, the time policy that the disciplines have constructed. This time arrow, the Professor Denise has talked about this time arrow that modernity builds, the time that denies the existence of and whiteness has a role in talking about Brazil. That's what I know more. We have a country where universities are built from a material place that's very concrete. That is whiteness, that is white supremacism, that is whiteness over the construction of curriculum, the knowledge. It's all centered in this whiteness discourse. So if you take small things such as, for example, a tendency to think that the post-war, the notion of limit event from the Holocaust produced a pluralization of the historical time. So we think Lévi-Strauss and thinking anthropology as well, if it was an effect of the relationship with Europe, with that catastrophe. But how many other catastrophes have happened before that, the so-called event limits? So thinking in another Afro-diasporic author, when he questions in the post-war that there's in Europe that saw as a humanistic, like discussing the racial questions in the post-war, but actually did not worry effectively with the concrete existence of the colonialism, the speech. So to discuss time policies from the history perspective as a Black person, professor of ethnical racial relations, makes me think that this debate, I have students that get to the last term and they don't learn about indigenous and Black relations. They don't learn about these knowledges. And it's a very white-centered knowledge. And sometimes I see that the post-colonial, decolonial discussion, when it's centered to the critics, to Eurocentrism and not discussing whiteness, loses this discussion about racialization. I think we could discuss that a little bit, but this bothers me a little bit. And when I see my students getting there, not having these knowledges, not having these intellectualities, students of sociology, not knowing, having never seen in their syllabuses Black and indigenous authors in a country that theoretically so plural, as the colleagues have shown here. And the time policy, when you talk about whiteness time policy, we have to reflect upon the way this coloniality of knowing in the discourse of racial democracy, how this discourse denies the existence of white supremacism, which is concrete. We just have to do the test of the neck to see that it circulates and it prioritizes the production of knowledge in the syllabuses. We have a law, I don't know if you all know, there's people from the outside that mandates the Institutes of History, the mandates the teaching of indigenous culture teaching, but it's not implemented. And I really think that it has to do with the exercising of whiteness in the spaces of power, and that reproduces a time policy that denies the contribution, the agency of Black and indigenous people in the construction of national history, the construction of knowledge, of thinking. And this, for me, is a very important question as a person of a teacher training, in teaching the students. And it makes me very uneasy. You know, it's going, next year is going to be 20 years, the act, and we haven't been able to create a systematic teaching of Afro-Brazilian indigenous teaching. And this is very sad. I myself, I'm the professor at the University of Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. It's been 2 years that this is a mandatory subject. There's just me and another Black teacher in the whole department. So I got in this context where this subject became mandatory, and not because of the university itself, but because the public ministry has subpoenaed the university to rethink this question. So this institutional racism, the way that whiteness thinks, it doesn't think its place. It denies its place to reaffirm its power position, because whiteness is not a speech or an ideology, but it's a power position and systematic exercise of this power, this white supremacy. So to reflect about decoloniality and post-coloniality, so, and I'll wrap up, just not to go so long, we have to discuss about whiteness and what us Black people, indigenous people, we have to point this out to white people to discuss about themselves, because without the contribution of those people, we will probably not be able to think about teaching ethnical racial relations and think it critically. That's it. Thank you.
Muito obrigada, Marcello.
Thank you very much, Marcello. Now I'm going to yield the floor immediately to Barbalorixá Luciano. He's going to bring his considerations for us to think about in this first moment to finish the roundtable, and I thank you very much for your participation and your considerations. Okay, thank you. Good morning to everyone.
Eu não poderia falar.
I could not talk about ancestrality without introducing with my feet on the earth, I'd ask,
E a minha alma todei, a minha ulumi, e a minha oiadei. Baba mi jagum, baba minha diaguna, baba mi odetomilare, baba mi baru, elegbara, licença. É a benção.
and let's excuse a blessing to the elderly, to the youngest, and to my king. My name is Luciano Gomes Guerreiro. I'm a Orixá, a leader of a Candomblé house, a share house in the Rio Vermelho, Salvador, Bahia, Brazil. I'm the son of Saint Gilmar Souza Moreira, leader of Vilê. I'm a granddaughter, Angelina do Miá.
Estou aqui representando todo o meu povo.
Grandson of Darilé. And I'm here representing my people. I'm very glad to come to Santa Catarina and feel inside a house of a share. And I have here opening of a black eye, the eyes of the earth. I'm very happy come to a debate about Crossroads, which is my beginning. It's our beginning, middle, and end, where everything is crossed. And where I see the dance, it's one of the points, the excellent points of Candomblé. I see music with the calling to the African gods, which is done through music, our instruments, and I see Padê, it's a meeting, a satisfaction to our ancestors. So I feel at home listening about the indigenous experience, the African experience, the professors, my great respect to the academics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about education in Candomblé houses. We see the Candomblé house as a core for resistance education, where we try to rescue daily all the young people in our community, where I have my association, Religious and Cultural Association, and we have a daily fight to rescue. We can see through time, and we are the time. I'm representing in my ancestrality, so I'm past as well. I'm Luciano Gomes, I'm here as the future, and I'm reaping my seeds to be an ancestral, so I'm present, past, and I'm representative of all this. So it's very important to listen to people, African people, indigenous people, and here inside the Candomblé house, we are almost ecumenical religion because we embrace all other religions. We embrace Black people, we embrace indigenous people, so we are ecumenic. I remember a chant that my father, who was indigenous, he sang when he arrived.
E ele chega com todos os orixás. Itaicuru, quando chega em sua aldeia, e ele chega com todos os orixás. Ô viva Deus, ô viva todo santo negro. Itaicuru na sua aldeia leal. Então ele engloba, né? Os orixás.
So it encompasses orixás, the Black saints, the indigenous, because he was indigenous at Nobre Leal village. And he's teaching to us as a spirit is to embrace the past, the present, and to be the future. So it's very good to debate the time. It's very good. I felt very embraced by this event. I felt inside my Candomblé house. I'd like to thank the people who brought me here, the institution AYA, for doing this. And that's it. Throughout the debate, we can clarify some things. So I just don't take a lot of time. Thank you very much.
Bom, a gente já
Okay. We expected that this round table would bring very important reflections to us. And when we thought about the subject possibilities in this event, we put the importance of discussing time. And why discuss time, knowing that there are many other people who are not necessarily in the history field? History is a science that deals directly with time. So maybe this is one of the elements, as the second most important element, dialoguing yesterday with the moments of the play that we watched when they talks about the importance of the moments. The other important factor for history is humanity, our people. So we deal with what people do in a specific time. But this history as science with the capital H, it evidently has approached something that exists, that can be seen, that can be materialized. And as per that, we'll also have a series of possibilities of reflection that will oblige us to think about all that's not in the field of the material. So where does this fit in the production of knowledge? How does this make knowledge to revitalize, to open new frontiers, to include other possibilities? If we are tied to a notion of history as a science of people in time, the classic definition of Marc Bloch, we lose a series of dimensions that were extremely well pointed out here in this setting. So I will very briefly mention some questions so that we can follow up with our talk. Aline started her instigation thinking about ancestral history as history that allows us to think of a different form of science, and thinking about this ancestral history that dialogues a lot with what Babyliciano brought us. We will have to think of a different form of education. We'll have to think of another form that's able to encompass that has also been thought. That's why we're here. Héctor proposes us to think of cycles, this history that we look at it, and it's very linear, but it has never happened in a single form, in a single moment. So it may seem that people here have talked before and they have synchronized their talks, but Hippolyte brings the importance of thinking synchrony and diachrony, what happens at the same time, but also that doesn't happen at the same time, but keeps the same. And when he talks about ambiguity and thinking about the figure of that big man issue like Bará, depending of the places where we put ourselves in this huge Brazilian territory, we can think of the data of simultaneity that maybe is that element that is most done at the crossroads. Everything is, everything can be, was, and can be again. And a series of reflections for us to think, and that evidently will be connected with the crucial element that Marcello brings for us to think, the time policy that is given by whiteness, because this historical science that brings us so far, and even if we're not all historians, maybe we're in classroom, not in classroom, all of us are involved with the act of educating, of maintaining knowledge, transforming, and whiteness incites necessarily over each one of those possibilities. It's always put, we face it, it's not our center, but it is a moment in which it is present at those crossroads, defining several paths. So I say that because the ideas here were very pointed out in a very important way, dialoguing a lot amongst each other, put in the crossroads as actual possibilities. So I can't refrain from saying that, talking about the element, I'm a part of a Black women movement. We say that our steps come from far in dialogue, from looking at the past to understand where we are, and to project the future. In history, projecting the future is almost a confrontation. We always have to discuss this because, I don't know, sociologists that talk about the future, philosophers think about things that don't exist, history, talk about what happened so far. But we are always looking to the future. We have to look to the future. So to wrap up and open to debates, I always like to call the attention to some data that for me is crucial. It marks the history of this country, specifically about Black population. And unfortunately, is an example that extends to indigenous population. Black men and women that lived in slavery centuries 16 to the beginning of 19, they haven't lived with freedom as a formal data, but he never stopped believing that freedom would arrive. So hope, having hope, projecting the future, has also been in our story. It is present in our history when we look, and it's over people and subjects. It's what history does. So that said, I'll thank you again for your considerations, and I'll open again. And we have about 30 to 40 minutes to have your considerations. And just since we're doing simultaneous transmissions, that host to make questions, do it in the microphone so people who are at home can listen to you. So if you don't, people who are home won't be able to listen. Okay, so I'll do this first round and the questions, and then we go back. And just to remember that we will keep meeting on the hallways in the digital world that allows us to connect as well. Okay, so who would like to make any considerations, questions? Please, Adriano.
Bom, primeiro eu quero agradecer também ao
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to be here,
pelos ensinamentos e pela
for being here and for understanding, like Professor Fernanda said, that education is a space to think about the time. All of that is not defined. So when we think about this place, this crossroads, as she mentioned, this crossroads of time and places, you know, I'd like to link that to Baba Lucian and Professor Hippolyte, because I think there was something nice for us to think about non-formal education, because we understand formal education. So we have here doctoral candidates and Dr. Baba and many people, because for me is that you're all in the same place. It's knowledge, because knowledge has no place. Knowledge has a form. And I think that's what Professor Fernanda meant, I think. So I'd like to provoke both of you so that you can talk a little bit about this crossroads of education on the grounds by means of elements that are not given by classical historiography. When we think about this classic historiography, we're going to think about what Professor Fernanda is mentioning, something that's Eurocentric, white, and it tells us how to teach even. And I think these spaces break this possibility. And then there's the bridge so that we can think about this in the academia. It's not just the academia to acknowledge the grounds and the indigenous ancestral knowledge as important, but how does it incorporate all of that? How would you make that be incorporated? So on general terms, I put that to everyone, but that's because I saw the connection between what you both mentioned and also Aline, that also has to do with this ancestral theme that I'm very much interested in, instead of classical historiography and the repetition of the names of the authors and all of that. Thank you.
Bom dia para nós.
Good morning. I'd like to thank you. It's thrilling to be here. I think Aline was great in her talk because it calls us to a responsibility. Since we are in the academia, I am a professor of history theory, and also talking to Marcello about that, how can we build other histories? Because we have in the academia in Brazil, we have other students, and it's wonderful. We're others now. And how wonderful that the academia nowadays represents much more our society than 20 years ago. But how to build other histories? We who still have a theoretical reference and epistemological reference based on Eurocentrism and the whites. And so my talk, since I'm here, I want to talk about this will. I have this will, and I guide my students, but I talk I have a dialogue with this decolonial thought, but I still feel a lot of difficulty in terms of how to build these other knowledges. Thank you so much for this moment. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I am Cynthia Araújo. I'm a professor of the education faculty of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I train history professors, so I'm very much interested in this discussion, and I've been thinking about all of this for a while. I'm very touched. These conversation roundtables, this one in particular was very special to me. So to be listening to people who are so different and important, and they affect me a lot, profoundly. When I think about Crossroads, I always think about a place of power and meeting, but power in terms of potency and strength, because time is not something that we work only with history. Time structures us as human beings, as we can see who we are and how we understand the world. So when I think about time and Crossroads, time, Crossroads as the title of this panel, which is the perfect title for that, I always remember something from the Umbanda tradition. I'm not going to chant now, not going to sing, but it says, it's relatively well known, and it says that there's a reference to Oxóssi, which is the Orisha that in general is related to the caboclos, at least in Rio. And it says that I crossed the sea swimming on top of 2 barrels, and it was to see Jurameira and the caboclos from Brazil. And whenever I think about this, I think about this need, which for me is essential for us to balance ourselves on top of these 2 barrels. We need to gain our balance on top of these 2 barrels. I think we can no longer leave these 2 barrels nowadays. We're here because we have reason to be here, and we would like not to have these reasons, but we are maybe balanced on many other barrels. So I'd like to talk about that, how we think about a time crossroads, and we are balanced on top of these 2 barrels, and they establish a dialogue with the person who asked before me. How can we create other possible histories? That's even the thesis of my doctoral thesis. Other histories by balancing, by trying to regain our balance on top of these 2 barrels. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll just close this first step now so that we don't have too many questions, and maybe it's a lot, so that we can talk. And then if we have time, we can open for more questions. I'm going to pass the floor to Baba Lucian. Can we do that so that we can begin? And then we can move around. First of all, Candomblé, for you to speak, you need to sit down to learn first. It's the first thing. So it comes from the spoken language. You have to respect the elders. You have to respect the customs, right? I am a boy. when I look at my ancestors. So if I don't respect them, I'm not going to be respected. That's the first thing. Those who knock on the door of a candomblé, normally nobody gets there and say, I'm okay, I'm fine. No, mostly the people go there because they have wounds caused by the world. And we're there to heal those wounds, to take care of the spiritual side, because people think a lot of the material and the physical, and they don't prepare the spirit for the world out there. So we're going to cure and heal those wounds. We have to treat the individuals as beings. We have to explain to them what's their place in this spiritual plane within candomblé. Your root is this one. You have a grandfather, you have all these other ancestors before him, and we are masters of those who come to us, because there is an entire difference between the teachers and the masters. Vilmar de Souza Moreira is my master. He was the one who taught me the candomblé that I know today, and he taught us. Because sometimes the elders from candomblé, sometimes they teach us in a harsher way, so that we learn not to be so sensitive sometimes on the outside. So in this way, in Xirê of a candomblé, it gives us a great teaching. First of all, in Xirê is a circle that we create, because it's a circle automatically is in front of the older one, because Orisha teaches us that we need to look to the future. And the future is that Abian is the one who's going to be initiated, the one who's going to pay his dues in Ashe, and he's going to be the Baba Lorisha. And when I'm gone, he is the one who's going to be wetting the seeds that I planted. This is the most important thing, humbleness. Candomblé teaches us that. Candomblé, my Ashe, is feet on the ground. So Orisha teaches us that regardless of what we are, we need to have our balance and be with the feet on the ground, and to have to be humble. This is the greatest legacy of candomblé. And the didactic of living with candomblé, if we explain it, it's not as attractive as you live the candomblé. You only know candomblé if you live candomblé. Nowadays, there are many people who know African knowledge and the Yoruba way of speaking, but they don't live the candomblé. They don't have their feet on the ground. They never slept late or woke up early or worked with chickens and remove their feathers and does the work in Imiaró. So the didactic of teaching candomblé is very important. And we are open doors. Nobody denies a plate of food, but nobody calls the person to eat inside your home with your family in your sofa. And candomblé is open doors. All around, the doors are open, and making it clear also that there's a respect to the other religions. Candomblé does not need to show that it is candomblé. Actually, candomblé is already a way. It's not just a religion, it's a life choice. Because the person in candomblé, wakes up and sleeps being a candomblé and lives candomblé. So we respect a lot those who come. We cannot talk about equality if we don't talk about respect. So it's very important to respect. In my community, there is the Christian church and the Catholics, because we live in communion. At least I do that. I always try to respect, since I start my time with candomblé early and to finish early, and in a certain way, not to bother anyone else. I bother in other ways, by making things happen inside my ebe. And how do I make things happen? I show children in my community that there are other paths. I intend to take a lot of things, that the seed that I'm planting here, that other people might pick up the fruit. And it's no use for me to be here to teach. I'm here to learn more than anything with intellectual people. I want to learn with you. And I want to take all of that to my people, to take this knowledge to them. When Oxóssi goes to Madagascar, he goes to hunt. I come to hunt and take that to my people. So this knowledge that I'm acquiring with you, I want to also get that. And I also want to tell you what candomblé is, because candomblé is not just beautiful clothes and the chanting and the songs. We need to leave sometimes a social life to make things happen. Sometimes you need not to have a car, but you have a project going on in the Ciudad de Berber. Sometimes you leave every day so that you run for your bread, so that everybody who's inside your home do that. You have that obligation based in candomblé. You don't have members, you have children. So I was someone who was created. I was a child created by Georgina da Costa Santana, Yalorixá of Umbanda, of Oxóssi ground in Bahia. And I always tried to give what I did not have. It's another meaning. Candomblé does that to us. We always need to give our best to those who seek us. And this is the best way to teach, with love. When we are loved, when we're respected, I say that we're not seeking tolerance, we're seeking respect. I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be respected. I want the respect to my ancestry. I want to respect the place where I occupied. And now I am among intellectuals and people from the academia. This is a place that I conquest. On with them determined, and I'm here to talk to you because I conquered this. And candomblé has that too. We don't say you are obliged to listen. No, we would speak to those who want to listen to us, because knowledge is a source that only who's thirsty can drink. So I don't need to look for people to show that my religion is this or that. No. I need to wait for people to be thirsty for knowledge, and they will come to me, to the source. I have nothing to prove. Those who seek me, those who wants to come to Ashabaru, wants to drink from that fountain, they can drink and quench their thirst, and to show the world that love to other people exists, and all of that. And education is there as well, because we put people to study and all of that, and we make people quit drugs. Sometimes we have a lot of people who live inside Ashabaru, and we consider everyone our children. So this is a great legacy, the education that we can give to our children, to love other people and to respect the customs.
Okay, obrigado.
Thank you for the opportunity. I heard intently the answer from Baba Lorisha. I don't have much to add because he already said it all. Everything that we can listen about education in candomblé. Well, maybe just drawing a parallel line with to Vundum, which is our religion in Benin. Vundum is the national religion in Benin. Here we can mirror saying that it is a type of candomblé, or candomblé is a type of vodum. But in addition to vundum, of this word voodoo that refers to religion as a whole, we also have the divinities. I showed only one voodoo a while back, so it's a divinity. And voodoo is also that idea that people have from tarot movies, and let's not deny that. When there's an action, you have a reaction. So when I want to protect myself from someone who wants to do harm, like they say, if that person attacks me, that person is going to receive an answer. And I'm okay, I'm not going to attack anyone. But when there's an action, there's a reaction. That's in this sense. And it's a sense that was not very much learned, very well in the common sense. But in candomblé, in the vodun, education is essential because, first of all, it is a religion that it's based on solid grounds in education. It's a social organization that's very well done. Let's put it that way. We have hierarchy in candomblé. Baba Lorisha was mentioning that Abian, we have these Mãe de Santo, Pai de Santo, we have a hierarchy, and this hierarchy does not obey necessarily the idea of hierarchy that we have in the West. I can be a judge. My older brother can be a mechanic, and I must absolutely respect him. It's not because I'm a judge and he's a mechanic, or he works within the bus charging people, that I'm not going to respect him. So this hierarchy is there in several dimensions of religion as well. So my mother was initiated after me, but I am older than my mother. So this seniority principle needs to be worked, needs to be considered in a very careful manner. There are laws, there are principles that are dear to the religion. It's a family of saints. You have Vivaldo da Costa Lima wrote a book about this saint family in Jejinago in Bahia, and I highly recommend this book. You know, in terms of social organization, it's very well treated. It's the only book, in my view, that talks about the complexity of the family of saints ever produced in the Americas. And it's a jewel, really, about what we mean with this social organization, because it's going to talk about several works in Africa, in Nigeria, Benin, that have also suffered and had this formation in the British school, which it was a school that had a lot to do with anthropology. So social organization principles, even the incest, that's also dealt with in its more explicit form and expanded form. It's not because we are brothers of saint that we're going to get married. The principle is there. So each action inside candomblé, each bad action poorly done, it's also reprehended, like in a common family, you know? If a child is doing too much for my patients, you know, it's very agitated. If you just look like that, the person knows that it's wrong. You don't need to raise your voice, and you don't raise your voice, in fact, indeed. Above all, if you speak too loud, the ancestors are there to also scold. So education is multidimensional in candomblé and also in voodoo, and also not to mention, you know, education outside of this religious scope. Yesterday we talked about an author from Africa called Samben Usman. He did not need to go to the university to create what he created. So we have the iconoclast, the destruction of images that are sacred. We're not always going to be aligned with these images. We can deviate in a positive sense so that we can reach something. Sate, greetings. Don't forget us. When you, in the halls of the universities, when you see one of us, when people talk about our people, they already talk about the past and say, oh, here the Guarani used to live. They were here in this area. Although the name of the city may be a Guarani name, but we lived there. We were there, but we're no longer there. So we're always in the past. I always thought about the title of this meeting, you know? And I can't do that because I live in this colonizing threat all the day. So to be in the college, the university, and to do master's and doctorate, that's a struggle for us. Because certainly if we did not have these degrees, we would not be here. But my mother went to look for this degree, and she has not done that, because paper is only for you that's worth. Because for me, what she knows is worth it. And also native peoples who are in urban areas, we were the ones who went to the city, and the city invaded us. Because that's that too, you know, the society looks at us and said, oh, you're no longer an indigenous person, you know how to speak. As if I still had guilt from the condemnation that was caused to me when they silenced my people. My people does not have all the vocabulary to speak of that. The people from the Mantiqueira and the women have all of their learning. And they talk by making food and of a tree that's related to the baobab tree, but that's not learned in schools. So don't forget us, don't silence us. Don't put us in the past, in prehistory, because it's not always that we can be in meetings like this. How many of us are in meetings like this? How many of us are here to talk to you? But you were there in the university, and so take us. I wish this education, so much talked about, it's as if it were learning, that you do that since you wake up and then you sleep and you dream and you also learn from your dreams. If we did that, we would break a lot of prejudices, because our people for more than 500 years still killed on a daily basis. This is not victimization. This is data, history. Still, we have memory. Still, with the imposition of Tupi linguistic trunk, with the education in Yangadug, that was a language that was forged for commercialization, and those who were Makurajé or Pan or other linguistic trunks that had to learn how to communicate, and then they had to learn Portuguese because it was forbidden to speak this language that they created themselves. We still had Chotepote. So my heart vibrates when I speak to my people. My heart vibrates when I think about my ancestors, when I am close to a relative, when we are here as resistance and a movement that's much more than that, because your resistance, you know, you say, no, we're movement. Brazil is the son of indigenous mother that rejects his mother until today. When I am in our space, we created an indigenous publishing house that also welcomes Black women who know our work, because they also understand that we were always together. And we work with linguistic repairs and reparations. We launched 4 books for the Traupo people, Burugubora people. The first book written by Native people, from that people. It's an honor for me, but it's also sad, because there is a historical denial in our society. Because where's culture? Where's language? Where are your clothes? Not every people use indigenous clothes and paint their bodies, because we're diverse. We are related to our forests. Our medicine has to do with our forest. And then they get to our space and they ask, where are your clothes or anything? No, rapé or some other type of medicine. And I say, no, that's from another indigenous tribe, but that stereotype was created, and this also begins in university. History professors, they leave the university without knowing the name of one Brazilian people of the nation. Because in the Constitution, we, Native people, you know, we, the Native people, we were not allowed to speak of an original nation. That's why you have indigenous, you have Indian, and Native. Because that was not allowed to us. And you cannot be allies of this part of history. You need to be our allies. You need to do at least what they did that. In each meeting, because you have, in every event, you have an Aboriginal person to speak. You need to know what's behind all of this. You know, it's an illicit history that is there and that became truth.
Tô convocando, hein, gente?
So I'm calling you, right?
Segura minha.
Because, you know, I have to hold my hand strong. And don't think that it's easy to speak. Sometimes we speak and people say, oh, but, you know, it's like a jaguar, you know, someone who's angry. The jaguar from Mantiqueira is here. No, but the jaguar needs to defend herself and needs to say, because otherwise we're swallowed.
Chutepoteia, boa luz.
Sí. Bueno, de lo que
Well,
comprendí de la,
from what I understood of the questions,
me quedo con la siguiente pregunta. ¿Cómo construir
the question that I'm going to answer is, or I'm going to ask a question rather, how can I build other histories? This is a challenge and it's concrete,
porque nos lleva desde el plano más
you know, because
teórico o epistemológico?
we think about theory and epistemology and also a technical and a more practical and political arena.
Yo agregaría otros elementos
I would add other elements to this question
porque podemos pensar en
because we can think of constructing another history, right? And it's fashionable to think about another history for the effects of building narratives, sometimes that are apolitical and essentialist in many cases. But I think we should think about the reconstruction, not only the construction of other histories,
sino la posibilidad de
but also the possibility of these other histories to be projected, to be globalized, to be universalized, and to be imposed. Because in my view, we should think especially about building histories that
de opresión
deconstruct oppression ways, oppression means for the land, for human beings, indigenous people, our great diversity,
y que proyecten la
and that project liberation.
o sea, entonces yo creo yo
So
replantearía la pregunta en esos términos.
I would rephrase the question like that: how to rebuild or reconstruct, and how to contribute
Esas historias
for these histories to be broken down and to break these relations of oppression, genocide, exploitation, of which we're talking about, but also propose or are transformed into liberation histories.
Ahí acotaría la pregunta, ¿ya?
So then that would be the question.
¿Cómo me respondería?
And how could we answer this question? Well, how,
Estamos tratando de responder esa pregunta.
since we're trying to answer these questions, because I must also confess that behind this question, there's a praxis,
Experiencias también.
and there are experiences as well.
Hay experiencia de
There are experiences of reconstruction, historical reconstruction,
indígena también en Estados Unidos.
indigenous too. United States, Canada, and Bolivia, for example, the case of Andino historical workshop in the Mapuche organization, which is the organization to which I belong. So there are experiences. We're not starting from scratch. The movement itself and the fight for liberation has always had its component of historical reconstruction, right?
Hablemos de procesos de descolonización.
So let's talk about decolonization processes and quote-unquote theoretical of the decolonization. They were always organic intellectuals.
Por ejemplo, ¿no? Fueron intelectuales orgánicos.
They were organic intellectuals.
¿Cómo reconstruir y
So how to build, reconstruct, and to make these histories to bloom and flourish, I think this is essential, the political position that we must have. A position and a commitment that's ethical, political, with transformation processes and processes of fight. This is the first point, in my view. So we need to think about these histories because, you know, the academia has absorbed a lot of this. It has done a lot of this exercise. Thinking about this political context in this dynamic. But if we want to be coherent, if we want to fight for these reconstruction processes, historical ones with this density, with this much density, we must be committed to working politically in an organic manner by means of collective and community means that are autonomous. So thinking about this, it's possible to have new investigation, new research questions, for example. With this foundation, it is possible to build new methodologies and also to adapt methodologies, right? Because we can't just throw everything away. For example, if we think about the indigenous territorial fights, for example, when we think about that, one can say that, no, you need to be based on other ontologies, on other ways of understanding the reality, and think about one or another element in the territory. Yeah, it is necessary. But the indigenous territorial fight also needs cartography, for example, right? It needs the review of historical archives and sources, right? Of which historians, they work with all of this. But the question must be formulated thinking about the alignments with the positions that we have within this process of fight and struggle. So that also enables not only new questions, but also new methodologies, and that allows us to put new methodologies and work based on these organic relationships of fight and collaboration. It's also possible to get to other points that have to do with co-theory, right? With co-production of other stories, with the definition of the genders, of promotion of these other histories that not necessarily can be spoken. They must be written, because if we don't write, others are going to write for us. Others are going to write for us. So visual, audiovisual, film, theater, radio, etc. But this exercise, in my view, going back to this, right, thinking about this other history, we cannot detach from these fight processes and struggle processes, because if they are not detached, they are co-opted, they are institutionalized. And based on political content, they are not going to be like that. Because finally, for these histories to flourish and to be imposed, because they are liberation stories, they need material basis and foundation. They need concrete struggle processes, because official history was imposed on us because of ideology, and they required a genocide. They required violence. They used violence. They used exploitation. They used concrete conditions, and they used colonialism, not coloniality, no, colonialism, capital. And those were the conditions of possibility for the history to be imposed. So for these other histories to be liberated, that they also require a radical transformation, a structural transformation of these conditions of existence. And this necessarily is important so that we can position ourselves and we can come up with efforts to rebuild or a historical rebuild by means of fight processes. I believe that this is one possibility of being able to advance in the construction and liberation of these other histories.
Well, after these amazing speeches, it's actually hard to speak, but I think that from a very particular perspective, as a Black person that was raised in the suburbs, and it occupied little by little the spaces in the university that seemed to me that was very it doesn't look has a nice look to Black people. There's an extra dichotomy due to the affirmative actions policy. There's a space reserved for the racialized people, especially Black people, not that much to indigenous. That's even more complex, but specifically Black people in the Afro diaspora in Brazil. I see that these other stories trying to synthesize a little bit the three questions. I see that they impose themselves a little bit to the strength of these people in the university space, the way they transform from this experience. We talk about candomblé houses, the educational importance of them. I tell this to my students, but there are several other experiences, the ghetto, to use. I didn't learn about ethno-racial relations in school. I learned my life experience in listening to rap. The sonic experience, the way Black people think and mobilize through their bodies, of course through writing, but also bodies, rap. We saw the first movie in the exhibit. What's the name of the MC? Yeah, amazing MC here in Florianópolis, the Flow Negrali, like talking about genocide, all stuff we're talking about here, genocide, about the experience, the massacre experience of Black people in front of a white world. So these people are here. We can see in the organization of AYA, they are occupying this space, even in, more and as students, not professors. But in the experience living in ghettos or being Black, bringing this knowledge that come from experience, being in Islam, rap, there's the data that come from experience. It transforms the scenario, the university scenarios, this component systematically, like a syllabus, course plans, and that means this positioning ostensibly and other forms of regression. When we think about, for example, how extreme right try to consolidate and has consolidated extremely racialized vision of our narrative. When we think about channels, for example, Brasil Paralelo, the strength and the money that has been invested by these spaces in building a white-centric narrative, and we see how they managed to, a series like The Last Crusade by Brasil Paralelo has 50 million visualizations, and not having a history channel, not even close to this, we see that there are certain battle spaces that we need to position ourselves so that this narrative is not reproduced. So on one side, we have occupied gratitude little by little the space in a way that I think that could be more accelerated. But at the same time, who has occupied the space has to know and have the humbleness to open the space that's still a privilege and power space so that other people can enter alongside us. And that means the very pragmatic things. In our university, we have a battle to institutionalize quota policies for indigenous teachers. And with this fight, there's institutional racism, structural racism that prevents people in these university spaces and whiteness that there can be Black and indigenous people. So this is our fight. We need to be the lead actors in this, in university, but beyond it, and use the small power we have and until its limits to be able to actually democratize the space.
Bom, gente, devido ao adiantado.
Okay, so due to the time, I will wrap up this table. Remember that evidently people will be around the hallways to talk. I'd like to thank you again, Héctor, Aline, Hippolyte, Luciano, Marcello, for your considerations, your shared experiences, evidently for your having accepted being here with us. Not only in this table, this is a big difference from this event. We're able to be together, go through all the activities. And I also would like to congratulate again the AIA team that's been conducting a great event, the team here in the theater, for all their support, the possibilities they are giving us, and that we are able to go on with our activities. Now I'll yield the floor to Tatiana because she has some considerations, some notices, and then we'll wrap everything up. Tati, please.
Obrigada, professora. Obrigada.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone, for the table. Now, just some small notices regarding the continuities of our program. So in the afternoon, here in the Álvares de Carvalho Theater, we have the cultural activity that starts 1:30, and after a roundtable, the existences, health, environment, fight for life at 2:30. In the cultural activity, the roundtable, Chile Vidal, Suzane Cassiani, Wilson Santi, Magda Diallo, Lina Tabá, Bonaventura Mojani, and 6:30, the contemporary dialogues in the Museum of Catarinense School. In Mask, we have in the afternoon the book launch sessions at 1 p.m. The first session, the book launch by Eduardo Oliveira Miranda, Elisão Antônio Paim, and Wallace de Santos Morais, where they'll talk about a little bit about their work, and they will have some books there to those who want to purchase. And the second session at 5 p.m., we have Juliana Rosa de Souza, Ana Lúcia Liberato, Professor Marcello, Felisberto Morais de Assunção, and Aline do Carmoche. Also, some copies available for purchase. And also the Museum of Catarinense School, there's the fair. I hope everyone can be there. The exhibit circuit. And tonight we'll also have the IPAD Festival at 8:30 at the Vitor Meirelles Square. Oh, so there's a lot of things. We're all invited.
Também gostaria de fazer convite.
Oh, I'd also like to invite you. I brought a work by me and Alberto Guarani, who's here, for you to get to know our territory, Mantiqueira. It's a video song, talk about historic atonement in the area. And so we'll be able to move our Puri memory space, led by us, to reinforce the identities of this region, in which there's a very big historical denial of my people. Thank you very much. I will show you very quickly.
Muito obrigado, gente, pelo convite, dividir essa mesa aqui.
Thank you for this invitation. I'm very happy with this extensions. I hope this event goes on very highly. Thank you. Thank you very much. Putting very clear that the Candomblé House is a big uterus where everyone is welcome, who goes to Salvador. Please feel free. It's your house. You can follow us on Instagram as well. Bless you, Ashe.
Muito obrigado por tudo.
Thank you very much for everything.
Casa, né? Como membro
I feel at home. Yes, since 2014, and I'm in touch with the desk. First time I came to Santa Catarina was in 2014 in an event. So I hope to be even more in touch with you, and anytime I'm able to contribute to the development of work, encounters, meetings, etc. And I'll also learn from you. Thank you very much.
Amigo de cara João Beate, Satê, que esse encontro espiralado não seja...
I hope this spiral meeting's not the last one in which we see each other, even though I have this visual impairment. I can feel your soul, your energy. Thank you very much.
Vocês vibraram meu coração hoje.
Have vibrated my heart today.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very
so
much.
Thank you so much in English and in Portuguese and in Spanish for having invited me, for the effort behind the entire team and everyone that made it possible for us to be here. I am learning, and I've tried to express myself as best as I could so that you could understand what was behind all this. And I'm inviting you for all of this. Thank you so much.
E assim eu dou por encerrada a mesa. Muito obrigada, gente. Que possamos continuar nos alimentando de conhecimento, alimentando nosso...
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very
and
much.
I close this now.
Até mais.
And we can resume activities. Thank you.
Pachamama, Jamais